Hey guys, this is the first in a new video series that I'm doing. I haven't decided on a name yet. I think it's going to be VV's Views. Kind of rolls off the tongue a little bit. Then plus you also got the alliteration. Basically today what I want to do is I want to kind of go over this post that I saw on Reddit this morning, where it basically just shows the number of CSGO players retired from 2013 to 2020. And I think a lot of people in the community maybe misunderstand what exactly this means. I'm going to kind of get into it because while I do think it's maybe a little bit worrying, I think it's both not as bad as some people say, but a lot worse than what other people say. So the first thing I want to point out is one of the reasons why in the early part of the game, you can think before 2018, 2017, 2016, 2015, there weren't really a lot of players that called themselves quote unquote retired. I think that there's a pretty good reason for that. And probably the chief reason is because there weren't a lot of big esports orgs that were heavily involved in Counter-Strike in the same way that they are today. I mean, there are definitely plenty of orgs involved. They just didn't have the money or the resources or the time or the power. I mean, one of the things that I can say, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later, is the injection of venture capital money into Counter-Strike has basically meant that these orgs have more money than they know what to do with. They have tons of resources. They can get coaches, they can get management. In the case of some of the biggest orgs like Astralis and whatnot, they can get some of the things that we've seen where they have bench players, they have the sports psychologists, things like that. And basically what that means is before that period in time, when a player just kind of stopped playing or transitioned to a different game or went down to a different team, there wasn't really the sense of retirement. In a lot of senses because they probably just didn't have the money to call themselves retired. And at the same time, there wasn't really an incentive to even call yourself retired. I mean, a lot of the guys at that period in time too, they were coming over from Counter-Strike Source. They were coming over from Counter-Strike 1.6. Basically, these guys, they might be retired basically kind of in concept, but in name, they were either waiting for the right team to call or waiting for a different opportunity or for a different game to come along. And some of them just became streamers and never called themselves retired because, while they weren't pros anymore, they were still essentially professional Counter-Strike players. They just weren't Counter-Strike pros. You can understand the difference. And that's compounded by the fact that, like I said, there weren't as many top-rate orgs back at that period in time. So if you had an org that just kind of folded and fell apart and all the players just kind of scattered to the winds, there wouldn't be any kind of retirement ceremony. There'd be nobody there to tell them, hey, put out a post that says you're retiring. There wouldn't be any kind of historical kind of context that these orgs can frame the players, because a lot of times now, you see some of the older orgs like Fnatic and Na'Vi, where they're kind of phasing out some of the older players, them saying, hey Guardian, why don't you put something out saying you're tired? I know he hasn't retired yet, but it seems like it's inevitable at this point in time. That maybe gives them a little bit of boost. It's something that the fans can kind of look forward to, say, hey, let's celebrate this legendary player's career. So that's one of the reasons why I think in the early part of the game you didn't see a lot of people call themselves retired. It's simply because there was really no incentive to. Then we go to 2018. Obviously the biggest part of 2018 was essentially the Overwatch League, is when it kind of got off the ground. And like we're going to get to today, kind of contrasting with where things are today, there were actually quite a few players that kind of left the tier 2 and tier 3 scene to go and pursue Overwatch. Good for them. My own feelings about the Overwatch League I'll put aside for the moment, but that's why you see more players at that period in time calling themselves retired. It wasn't just that they were stopped playing the game, as they wanted to declare, hey, I'm open to go and play Overwatch. I hope to go play Overwatch. I hope to be good at it. 2019, we saw a big downturn, and then 2020, this year, a few things to also put into context about 2020. Obviously, we've been living with COVID. There have been just as many tournaments, I would say, but they've been a lot longer. They maybe haven't paid as much per game on a per game basis. So you can think in older tournaments, you'd have a group stage, you'd have probably a bracket with all best of threes with basically similar money. So what it means is, yeah, the money winnings are the same, but the amount of games that you needed to win to get that money is actually a lot less than it is today. So you're playing more games for the same amount of money, and it's all online. And if one thing that we've seen for sure is that online games are always weird. There's always threats of cheating. I mean, I don't think it's any coincidence that this is when the coaching bug was discovered. There's been a lot of cases of stream sniping. Like, maybe I'll make a video about this one day, but I don't necessarily blame somebody like MIBR when they were claiming certain players were cheating when they clearly weren't, by the way. Like, I don't really blame them, because to a certain extent, I think that there's a lot more cheaters that are kind of getting away with it in the online era than would have ever before. That's not to say that everybody's cheating. I obviously don't believe that in the slightest, but there's going to be a greater percentage of it, so that's going to drive it. The other thing is obviously the elephant in the room that we have to address is Valorant. A lot of players have gone over to Valorant. Now, it's both more and less than you might think, and this is the reason why. So almost as a kind of counterpoint to this, I saw another post on Reddit that also said, here are the notable players that have retired. Basically, most of them you're going to see are going over to Valorant. So if we look at the retired players list, before we even get into kind of the minutia of the individual cases, like, the first thing to note is that North America is by far the most represented here with 33. Now, this is the part when I said earlier that it's both more and less worrying than I think a lot of people are kind of making it out to be. The North American side is definitely the more worrying part. That's the part that, like, worries me a bit, especially as a Native American, a Native North American. This is something that I don't like to see, because as much as I will cheer for European teams, and I got a lot of European teams that I really like, I do want to see this region do well. I do want to see, young Canadian and American players coming up. I want to see the older guys continuing to get better. I want to see these orgs do the best that they can to win more majors than just that Cloud9. I want to see Evil Geniuses and Liquid be successful. I want to see those younger orgs coming up, going from the tier 2 scene to the tier 1 scene, kind of being able to battle with the Europeans. And this is something that really worries me. Because you can see by comparison, South America, okay, not really a lot. Europe, a little bit more than South America. But as you go into it, some of these guys are kind of long in the tooth. Mixwell and Scream, legendary players. But what more do they have to offer the scene right now? Maybe they could do good at the tier 2 level. Maybe they could be used to bring up the next generation of players. But as far as being the impact players that those guys were, they really just don't have it anymore. CIS region, Angel, once again, was a good player, was a great player at times too. But at this period in time, don't know how much more he can have to offer other than his veteran experience. And honestly, maybe he would be better served as kind of a coach or a guy at the tier 2 and tier 3 scene to kind of bring other guys up. And, as you can see, Asia, none of these players really stand out all that much. I could be wrong. I don't follow the Asian scene as much as I should. And then Oceania, honestly, the only player that sticks out to me is Dick Stacy, and that's just because he tried to insert a penis into the game once. So the less said about him, the better. And now we get back to North America, and some of these names are kind of understandable. You got your Swags. Basically most of the your Steels, basically most of the guys that were involved in the iBuy Power scandal. That makes sense that they would want to go over to Valorant. They get a fresh start. It doesn't seem like Riot is going to be enforcing any of the things that Valve was enforcing on these guys. So basically they get to clear the deck, fresh new start, and everybody in Valorant is going to love some of these guys too. Like, I think Steel is one of the most underrated players, maybe in all of Counter-Strike. Not just for his impact in the game, but if you just look at the amount of young North American talent that he managed to develop over the course of time when he wasn't allowed to play at a lot of these big tournaments, it's almost unreal. I mean, you can think about it. If you're a young North American player who wants to get into Counter-Strike, why would you want to go and play with the guy who can't play at a major? But the fact that he not only managed to get these guys to play with him, but then almost like instantly when he started playing with them, they immediately improved their level. I mean, it's just kind of unreal. I mean, some of these guys never made it to the tier 1 level, but the amount of guys that he got to play with him and the amount of guys that he increased their game, just unreal. You know, you see some of these other guys like Sabrosa, you got like JDM and Hayes. Some of these guys were realistically never going to make it back to tier 1. You know, like some of these guys had their time, they had their opportunities, but realistically we're never going to get back. You know, then there's other guys like Sam, who's obviously pursuing kind of a streaming career right now and seems like he's doing pretty well for himself. Like, what worries me is Nitro and Steel, to a certain extent, even maybe somebody like Wardell too, is because these are veteran players that have been in in-game leading positions that have gone from the lowest tier of CS to the highest tier of CS, and that know how to get there, and that have been successful. And in the case of somebody like Nitro, I mean, Nitro was part of a team that basically speed ran the IEM Grand Slam Championship and won $1 million. I mean, it was almost insane when Astralis did it in, what, 7 tournaments or 8 tournaments, I think it was. And then Liquid just came in, we're just going to do it in 5 tournaments. Oh, and by the way, we didn't even attend one of those tournaments. So the fact that he was part of a team that was able to do that, I mean, maybe it wasn't all his in-game leading that kind of led to that, but the simple fact of the matter is you got to give the guy a lot of credit for being able to do that. And that's ultimately where my point is I think European Counter-Strike is going to be just fine. You know, I even think South American Counter-Strike is going to be just fine. You know, you've seen the new MIBR, which has started climbing the ranks. Furia, even though they had a brief period in time where they had to kind of refigure out their game and they had to adjust to the other teams adjusting to them, they've started to look like a really good team again. Again, Europe, as I kind of go over it, none of these guys were really on the way up all that much. You know, a lot of these guys are kind of over-the-hill players that didn't have a whole lot more to go. Same thing with CIS and Oceania. But this is the worrying thing, is that not only for North America is this just a talent drain in terms of pure number of players, which that's worrying by itself, but like I said before, it's the leadership, the veteran spirit of this. I mean, a lot of these guys still have a lot of kind of influence on the North American scene, and I think that it's really going to hurt them in the long run. And, you know, you combine this with the fact that, like, North American organizations have started to drop out. We've seen 100 Thieves basically just kind of sell off their Counter-Strike team. There's rumors that even more North American teams are looking to either sell or try to get a budget org, you know, cost-saving measures to save as much money as they can. So that's something that's something that's worrying, but I think that that's actually less important than this, because if we know anything about this game of Counter-Strike is that 5 guys can get together and kind of have a basement org and still at least put together enough money to be able to get from tournament to tournament until they can get picked up by a bigger organization. Maybe they sell a player off and then they get the money to themselves, become a bigger org. You know, maybe they just stay good long enough that they can get some venture capital money in and then basically become a big organization. And the worrying part is, like, if you are one of those orgs, where do you even start now? Because you've lost all kinds of veteran experience with these players. You know, you've lost some of the tier 2 and the tier 3 talent. And the other thing is, and this is something that's just an unfortunate reality, not just of North American esports, but of North American sports in general, is if you want to go to an advertiser or a venture capital person and say, hey, I want to start a Counter-Strike team, or I just want to start an esport team in general, they will go talk to other people. You know, they will talk to people they think that are industry insiders, people that they think that they know have some kind of information about the scene. And if they say, how come all of these other orgs are divesting? How come these guys don't want to sponsor them anymore? Like, that is going to be a big thing on the mind of a potential investor or a potential advertiser for your team. So that's going to be something where not only is the talent themselves gone, but it's going to be harder and harder for some of these orgs to kind of come from the ground up. You're lacking the leadership. And the other problem too is that there's a lot of experience drain from North America, not just in terms of that, but the fact that, like, we still don't really have a lot of great IGLs. You know, you could even argue that we still don't even have that much good coaching. I mean, guys that would even be in a position to become coaches largely don't in some instances. You know, you can think of somebody like Davey who still plays, who's basically on his way to becoming a commentator. You know, you can think of somebody like Flom, who's basically still kind of playing at that lower level and is becoming a caster. You know, even if these guys can't be good coaches in kind of the nuts and bolts sense, they might still be able to be decent coaches in the sense that they bring a veteran presence. They they understand where these young players are because they were once young players themselves. So basically, when you look at the end of the day, Counter-Strike is probably going to be fine. The Counter-Strike pro scene, it's not going anywhere. It's not going to downsize. I even think that once the COVID era ends, you're going to see the Valorant numbers kind of start to come down, and I think the CS numbers are going to stay consistent. They're going to dip a bit once people can start going out to restaurants and bars and doing other things. But I think the pro scene is going to be fine. But this is something that worries me with North America, is that what I'm afraid of is that you're going to have basically something like where Sweden was a few years ago, where you have kind of the top end scene with all the best players being kind of concentrated in a few teams and almost nothing underneath it, where the second, like, let's say a year from now, Liquid's looking to make a roster change and they got to go in tier 2 and they go, there's nobody we can get right now. Maybe we should go to Europe and look. Not that that's the worst thing ever, but like I said, teams like Liquid and Evil Geniuses, they've shown that they want to bring up young Americans. And if there's no talent at the tier 2 scene, if there's no veteran leadership at the tier 2 scene, and if there are no teams at the tier 2 scene, there isn't going to be a tier 2 scene. Basically, the pyramid, you know, of Counter-Strike, where you got your tier 3 orgs and the tier 2 orgs and then the tier 1 orgs, if it's just the top, well, the whole thing's basically going to crumble. And like I said, this is going to impact the Counter-Strike scene as a whole, but overall, if North America crumbles, the rest will be fine. But I think it'll be a shame if we lose that kind of thing. So that's my thoughts. Please, if you like this video, like, comment, and subscribe. I hope to do more in the future, and take care.